Hey everybody, this is Unblocked live every Monday and Wednesday in the afternoon. We have a special show today because for the first time there's 4 journalists all talking together who were at the Capitol in the Pacific Northwest and all over the country for the last couple of months. This is Unblocked Podcast. Thanks for joining us. We have Richie McGinnis. He is the lead videographer for Daily Caller. We also have BGontheScene, Brendan Gutenschwager. He is an independent who you've seen all over the country. And Ford Fischer of News to Share, also an independent. And we're going to be able to finally compare some notes. Hey guys, thanks for being on Unblocked Podcast.
We're here.
Thanks. All right. So the first question that I wanted to ask is, you probably get who was there when people talk about the Capitol. And strangely enough, I saw some recent articles that pulled right-wing supporters of the president, and many still believe that Antifa was a part of January the 6th. How do you answer that question? We'll start with you, Richie McGinnis. How do you answer that question when people say, was Antifa there?
I answer the question of, it's difficult to answer that question even at an Antifa protest in Portland. And, you know, that's because Black Bloc that's the whole purpose of the attire, is to mask your identity and to not be clear, you know, if you have any affiliations. And just because somebody wears Black Bloc doesn't mean they're Antifa, and just because somebody, you know, whatever sports MAGA hat, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that they're a Trump supporter. So usually you have to interact with those people and actually ask them those kind of questions. And
so you're saying, when you say that, you're saying people can appropriate each other's attire?
Yeah, I've seen it all over the country. I think probably all of us have to a certain extent. So my only point there is that answering that question definitively in a binary way is pretty difficult. I mean, there were instances of left-wing activists as well as, you know, an overwhelming number of right-wing ones.
And certainly some wild.
Just said that Andy Ngo was there. He just claimed that Andy Ngo was there too. So I can definitively tell you that Andy Ngo was not there. But as for Antifa, I think that's a more difficult question.
I saw that post as well. And certainly when you have fringe of the fringe kind of outliers like Jaden X, John Sullivan, it becomes harder to sort of parse everything. But we'll get to that. Ford Fischer, how do you answer the question, was Antifa there?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the point that Richie is making, but I would say that if it's a person who's saying, I love Donald Trump, and they're wearing a Trump hat, like, I'm not, while there can be room for exceptions, such as I'm sure we're going to talk about John Sullivan, I have not seen any evidence that anybody there was really anything other than what they were, right? So out of the original, people were claiming this Antifa was their thing, I think, before there was like any reason to think that. People claimed that well before the, you know, John Sullivan thing was sort of out in the public. And there were 2 original pieces of information that people tried to use to claim this, right? The first one was that there was an AI company that had some kind of facial recognition program, and they saw that there was one person at the Capitol who there's a photo of that person on an Antifa website. Well, whose photos with their face are show up on Antifa websites, right? They're not posting profile photos of themselves. They were doxing somebody, right? It was a photo of them with a far right person, and it was Antifa trying to sort of like expose them or what have you. So that was fake, right? The other one was that there was the individual with the horns, right? And the horn guy was originally kind of miscast as some kind of a leftist because there was a photo of him once at a Black Lives Matter protest. And most of the original usage of this image cropped out the sign that he was carrying, which said, Q sent me. I've actually interviewed that individual before. On December 12th at the second of the Million MAGA marches, I interviewed him. And basically in that, he claimed that the Supreme Court was corrupt because they wouldn't take up the case about election fraud. And so he was he was, at least at the time of the incident, his lawyers have now said that he feels betrayed by Trump. But at least until the incident, there's no reason to think he was anything other than a QAnon believing Trump supporter. And so the only now evidence that I've seen, which I think is pretty clear, of somebody who infiltrated it who does not actually have MAGA beliefs, is this John Sullivan character, who leftists had also described as an infiltrator who was exaggerating or creating violence like at a level that they hadn't been advocating throughout the year 2020. So to be honest, I have no clue what John Sullivan personally believes politically, but it's pretty obvious that he's sort of a general instigator. Who knows if he has political beliefs or if he's just there for the violence, as some might say.
Brendan, how do you answer the question when people ask you, was Antifa there at the Capitol?
Well, I think Ford said it best in a really detailed way there. There's always going to be that room for people to misrepresent or to don somebody else's attire in an attempt to sort of put themselves as that type of person. But from what I saw from the types of people that were there in terms of how they were chanting and what they were saying to each other, it was pretty clear that it was Trump supporters there and that it wasn't really an Antifa infiltration thing. Now, with that being said, may there be individual instances where that has cropped up here or there that somebody was present? It's possible, but I've seen no sort of wide-scale evidence of that. Honestly, not even minuscule evidence, because I think Ford detailed it pretty well there in the specific examples that people were trying to cite. I would add in on that the Horn guy, the QAnon guy. I had actually seen him at a Trump rally in June of 2020. I captured a video of him outside. It was when Donald Trump was going to Phoenix. He had done Tulsa and then had gone to Phoenix to speak a couple days later. And he was there very much giving pro-Trump messages. And this was all the way back in June. So unless this was some extremely long-term sort of endeavor, I think that we have to just go with what he was saying he was. And that's this QAnon supporter, and that he might have been present at those Black Lives Matter protests, but was not espousing those types of views very much aligned with the Trump one. So yeah, there really just has not been any evidence presented that Antifa was behind any of this.
I would just add that Jake Angeli, the name of the person we're talking about, although he goes by Q Shaman, he lives in Arizona, right? He's a well-known pro-Trump person within the Arizona activism scene. So to people on the internet, I mean, I can understand why people could sort of be fooled into this sort of thing. But to people who are actually kind of like familiar with activism, both BG and I have met him. I think it's pretty obvious. The one other thing that I would point out, and I realize that this is somewhat sort of circumstantial, someone could say that this isn't sort of perfect proof, but out of the people who have actually been arrested so far, there are criminal complaints that kind of detail this is where we think the person was, this is their imagery, whatever, and they're always linking to their social media posts. It always is like showing they said this and this, and the motivation is always extremely clearly described. Somebody could counter argue, well, somebody could kind of like pretend to be a Trump supporter on the internet and then show up. But I mean, for all intents and purposes, there hasn't been anything to suggest anything like that. And none of these people have offered as a defense the opposite. Well, they're actually, a leftist or whatever. The only one who's kind of offered something like that is John Sullivan, saying that he believes he was there as a journalist. But meanwhile, while he was there, he said, let's burn this down. So, I mean, he was very obviously an instigator and not a journalist. Whoa, you sound like a space alien right now. I can't understand a word you're saying. Yeah. Holy.
It's the infiltrators.
Oh my God, that was scary. Then it was him laughing as a space alien.
So now I've switched to the. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, now we hear you.
I've switched off the mic and I've switched to the computer, so we'll just go with it. But what I was going to say, just going right by that, is that with John Sullivan, you have anti-fascist action and you have anarchist action. So someone like Sullivan could be culturally from the left and identifying more as anarchist, taking actions that are more chaos actor related, as opposed to being there as a quote-unquote Antifa or anti-fascist. Now, where we're missing Antifa's involvement is they had videographers, and this is very important, that they send videographers to events like this always, that were hanging in the back, that didn't go to the front lines, but we're sending video and putting it out along with talking points. So if you wonder why in the 2 p.m. hour or 3 p.m. hour, we're already getting talking points about this being about race, when all four of us, well, let me just ask the question. Did you think any of this from the people and their grievances was about race? Let's go around the table there. I will emphasize, though, that those talking points get out because Antifa-aligned photojournalists are on the ground. I know 2 or 3 of them whose accounts I've followed, who openly admitted to being there, who were posting video from on the scene. Mark Bray, in his book, The Antifa Handbook, talks about how Black Bloc is only a small percentage, but that actually having people who are quote-unquote press is a huge part of getting their message out. But let's go around that question. Were you surprised that the narrative took off so quickly to be about white supremacy? Richie McGinnis.
I wasn't surprised, no. I did see, some Confederate attire, so I think that's definitely worth noting. And I don't think people don that kind of stuff, just because they're in a rush to go out the door in the morning. With that being said, I've been covering the Proud Boys over the last year, and I know obviously Ford and Brennan have been around a lot of these guys as well. I mean, I've seen situations where people show up with Confederate flags and get shouted out of the area by the Proud Boys. So I think there's kind of a tendency to just ascribe anything that's far right to, xenophobia and racism. But with respect to the Proud Boys ideology, I wouldn't put ethnicity as one of the primary, preconditions for being a Proud Boy. Quite the contrary, actually. Like in Portland, for example, that's quite a mixed bag of ethnicities that you'll see at these things.
Ford, what's your impression?
Yeah, so I think that there's probably 2 different ways you could ask it, which yield 2 different answers. So if it was the Capitol siege primarily motivated by race, which I think is basically what your question is, then I would say pretty much no. I think that there was an enjoining factor of Trump. And it wasn't conservatism, it wasn't republicanism, it wasn't, Penceism or the ideologies of Trump. It's Trump. Trump, pure sort of Trump loyalty. And so in that sense, I would say that it was almost blind to anything else about policy or ideology. I think it's worth noting that there are, like Richie said, there were people who had Confederate flags and so forth. I would also add that there was certainly a presence of what has now been called kind of the Groypers, or this group that kind of has tried to appropriate the America First label, but then attach that to explicitly anti-Semitic policies. For example, Nick Fuentes did not go inside the Capitol. However, he was there on that day in December, and he was present at all 3 of the Million MAGA marches. And actually, my footage of him from the second one was used at the impeachment. And he, in an interview with me 2 years ago, described himself as a white majoritarian, which I think to most people they would say is essentially equivalent to white nationalism. He said, well, I don't technically want only white people. I just want it to be a majority white. Therefore, it's not white nationalism. So he's what I would say essentially a white nationalist, or most people would say that he's virtually white nationalist. He's also a Holocaust denier. So groups like that were present, and there's even some level of infighting. One thing that I thought was interesting, and then it ended up really just not being a part of my reporting on Jan 6 just because so much other stuff happened, was that ahead of the Trump speech, the America First Groyper group was actually yelling at people who brought Israeli flags. And to be clear, Trump supporters with Israeli flags. For the most part, the MAGA movement is pro-Israel. But they were chanting shame, shame, shame at people carrying Israeli flags, obviously on anti-Semitic grounds. So I think that it might be a little bit challenging to kind of differentiate what number of them were, what kind of ideology or whatever. But I think that I would also add Baked Alaska is the name of a live streamer who was a slated speaker at the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. Of course, no speeches ended up happening there. But he would have been a speaker at Charlottesville, and he was present there. And he did end up inside the Capitol and was ultimately arrested for his participation.
And published probably the craziest video of the entire thing, which is saying something.
Right.
Him calling from Nancy Pelosi's phone. That is just like, that is a crazy clip.
Brendan, how do you answer that question or assess whether when people say, "Hey, was this about white supremacy?"
It didn't seem like that was a primary motivating factor of all this. It seemed much more like it was the election. People were very, very much talking about the election, believing that it was fraudulent, believing that it was stolen, and that seemed to be the common glue. That, along with Donald Trump, just in general, support for Trump, loyalty to Trump, the loyalty to him specifically, even over the Republican Party. Those seem to be a lot of the dominating themes, dominating motivating factors that were bringing people there. You did see a few of those other things like Richie and Ford had described here, like the Confederate flags, which there weren't very many of those, but you did see them present there, including going into the Capitol building. And then, as Ford had mentioned, with a greater crowd. So, I mean, there's definitely elements that may be present at these things, but I would say in terms of what was the root cause of this upheaval that led to the siege of the Capitol, it was very much specifically the election, Donald Trump, and wanting to take that to Congress, basically, because they were there in the active certification of those votes right then in the afternoon.
Yeah, and how I pointed out earlier that Antifa-aligned press, sometimes these are just keyboard warriors that we're talking about. It's no accident that race entered the conversation by 2 p.m. if you were on Twitter. I saw a 2 p.m. tweet that said, and I won't call the person out just right now because I don't want to create more beef, but I got into it with one leftist Antifa-aligned self-described journalist, I guess you could say, who tweeted, if this were people of color, they would have been shot with live rounds. That was tweeted out in the 2 p.m. hour by somebody who has plus 180,000 followers, who's aligned with all the leftists. That goes, and that snowballs, a talking point like that. That was before anybody knew that Ashley Babbitt was shot, let alone killed. Already, that talking point was making the rounds before 3 p.m., before we knew anybody had died. It was already about race on Twitter before anybody asks people like us who were there, hey, what happened? Who was there? What did they want? And I think that's a very important point that I like to make over and over again, because there's a Twitter to tabloid pipeline here that runs all the way to the mainstream media, where Twitter activists and interpretations are trending first. Then you have Vox, the Daily Beast, all these other tabloid publications, Raw Story, that jump on the trend. Next thing you know, it's Rolling Stone, Variety, or Newsweek that have put an extra layer of legitimacy to opinions that are basically these hot takes from keyboard warriors. And I think that's frustrating for us. Another trend, armed insurrection was trending that day. Did you see any guns? Richie McGinnis.
I didn't see any guns. I saw some crowbars and some bats and a lot of bear spray. I didn't see any guns with my eyes, though, other than, what law enforcement was armed with.
Ford.
Yeah, same. I mean, there were certainly police officers, law enforcement that had long guns, but firearms were really not part of the equation as far as I was concerned. It was exactly like Richie just said, a lot of mace, baseball bats. I think at one point I heard somebody say, like, I have a knife. So I would say, generally speaking, non-lethals, but I think it's really important to note that a lot of these groups are groups that you would traditionally see armed, right? It's actually quite rare for me to go to something where the Oath Keepers are not carrying. And I think that that's essentially purely due to Washington, D.C.'s laws on the subject, right? There's almost nobody has D.C. concealed carry permits. There's no reciprocity. So you would have to have a pretty rare DC concealed carry permit to carry a gun in DC legally, and then you couldn't at a demonstration anyway. And they had set up for this 2 days beforehand, kind of the barrier where it said this is within 1,000 feet of a demonstration that's expected, so nobody, even concealed carriers, can carry legally there. So, in other words, no civilian firearms whatsoever would have been legal to carry even outside the Capitol at the moment that that was taking place.
And Ford, you made the point to me when we were in D.C. and I saw you that, for example, there were 6 arrests that were in D.C. that day. There were 3 that were in the Capitol vicinity, but not in the Capitol itself, as far as I know. Now, those numbers aren't terribly inconsistent with Million MAGA March 1, which was November 14th.
To be clear, you mean 6 arrests for firearms.
6 arrests for carrying without a license, correct, for firearms. So there were 6 arrests that were listed initially for that day. And 3 of them, as I said, were in the Capitol vicinity. 2 of them were actually by Capitol Police east of the Capitol, more towards the Supreme Court. 1 was by Metropolitan Police, and it was marked Visitor Center. They have not given me the details on that. But still, that's only 3 carrying without a license arrests within the vicinity of the Capitol. Is that terribly inconsistent with, for example, Million MAGA March 1 on November the 14th? Then December the 12th was Million MAGA March 2. There were arrests then. You had made the point.
All 3 events had some number of people who basically went into the city either intentionally, clandestinely carrying guns, and some people have offered as a defense. I honestly thought that my permit would work in Washington, D.C. I would add to your timeline that Enrique Tarrio was also arrested with 2 magazines, not with ammunition in them and not with rifles to go with them, and apparently he was planning to hand them off to somebody. But among that sort of roster of charges was basically AR-15 magazines that were illegal but functionally just plastic at the moment that he was arrested.
So David Gregory move right there.
How do you mean?
David Gregory brought AR-15 magazine on to meet the press, not realizing that it was illegal to do so in D.C.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's funny. There was no legal consequence for that, was there? I hadn't heard of that.
No, they went through the formalities and then I guess they dropped the charges.
Wow.
It's good old David Gregory. Come on.
Right. I don't think it's going to be that easy for Enrique, but we'll see.
No, I don't think
he's nice. We'll see if he brings that up in court, the David Gregory exception.
Well, I heard. Now here's I have my ear to the ground when it comes to what leftists are saying, and one theory, which I don't think is too. Usually, I won't spout off a theory, but one question that was asked, shall we say, on Twitter was, did he do this on purpose? In other words, is he trying to challenge the gun laws? When I spoke to Tarrio and interviewed him, he said he doesn't consider himself an extremist in anything except for the Second Amendment. He believes there should be no gun laws whatsoever. That's what he had told me in an interview. And it leads one to sort of wonder if this idea that he might have wanted to challenge the gun laws and came in, because why would you bring in magazines without an actual firearm?
His stated purpose and what he told the police officers, and there's a transcript, you can see that he hasn't disputed that the transcript is accurate. His explanation to the police officers was that somebody had purchased them from their online store. There is a photo of the mags out, and that they have the Proud Boys logo on them. They're a novelty item. And he claims that somebody tried to buy them and that he was unable to deliver them for whatever reason. And so he just decided to bring them since the supposed customer would be in Washington, D.C., and that it was his intention to hand them off. What's interesting about this, of course, is that having magazines in Washington, D.C. does not make them legal if your purpose is to sell them. Right? Oh, in my defense, officer, I was planning on selling the contraband. That's not a defense. But so at least on its face, that doesn't appear to be the case. But I mean, I also don't have any counter evidence to that theory.
That's interesting.
Yeah, he's just an idiot. I think that's.
Well, here's a comment from a viewer. Every second A guy knows how strict DC gun laws are. Nobody with a lick of sense would carry there.
And if I could hop in on that, one thing that I had noted in the weeks and days leading up to January 6th is that I saw a lot of groups, including ones from Michigan, who at a lot of Michigan rallies, you'd see a heavy firearm presence outside the Capitol, those kind of demonstrations. these groups were putting out notices saying, do not bring firearms. DC has strict gun laws. And, this was them telling amongst themselves, like, hey, just a heads up, don't be bringing firearms in. So I did see a sustained effort from some of these groups that were organizing like the buses and trying to get people together to go to DC, where they were saying, hey, this is not like those other rallies you went to over at the Michigan State Capitol or over at the Ohio State Capitol, and that you'd have these firearm restrictions. And then there were different signs posted throughout DC, as some people had seen there that had the different markings. You had mentioned the ones where it let you know that it was 1,000 feet away for anybody that did happen to have one of those rare concealed carry permits. But yeah, in terms of, out there at the Capitol, did not see any firearms of any kind other than what the law enforcement officers were carrying. The few National Guard that I saw out there earlier that morning, they had some, in at least the military police ones did with their vehicles. But, it just, in terms of the crowd there was no presence of that I had spotted.
Just one more question about the Capitol before we got some questions about Minneapolis, because the Chauvin trial is coming up. Jury selection begins next week. I want to ask about that. We have some other questions coming in. Anything else that you think, anybody can just jump in on this one, that the media is still getting wrong when it comes to the Capitol? Now, there's an interesting study, two of them that were out. I think I've mentioned this to you all individually. The Atlantic did an article about the University of Chicago, which characterized, they have a project called the Chicago Project of Safety, and they characterized the Capitol rioters as only 1 in 10 of the first 200 or so that were arrested initially as being part of a group like the Proud Boys or a militia like the Oath Keepers, and that a large number of them were unaffiliated. Now, the ADL took that a step further and they added QAnon onto that, and then they sort of more or less doubled that estimation. But even though we're talking about 80 to 90%, which are just quote unquote normie Trump supporters, that, Ford, you made the point that Trump was the glue that held this together. So, and they're also realizing that it's a much higher age demographic as well than what you might characterize as extremist action. And I always, right out of the gate, I said that this was more of a populist action. And anything that you guys want to weigh in as far as how I just characterize that, or how the media characterizes it in a much different way?
I think we actually just came out with an article on our website. There's a twice as high a statistical correlation for people basically being in poverty as there was for QAnon's support. So I think, in all the protests that we've all seen across the country, I think the most underlying theme there is economic distress. And I think that's not even something has been even factored in to the equation at all. I think just in terms of the conversation that's been had around this. Obviously, that's not excusing anything that happened, but in terms of talking about cause and effect, I think it's an important factor that's gone largely unnoticed.
And that a high percentage were business owners as well.
And I actually recorded a clip of a guy smoking a joint in there, and he said something to the effect of, I said, why are you smoking weed in the Capitol? And the other one went viral because he had American flag pants. But this guy, I think what he said was much more kind of indicative of why they were doing that. He said, I don't know, I'll probably get in trouble again, but my life sucks, so whatever.
Huh.
Well, I would say one thing that seems to be getting overlooked, there's this quickness to jump onto, oh, this is organized, oh, this was like a planned attack, this was something that, for weeks right off the bat, they were planning on it going down exactly like this or something similar to this. And I think people are kind of forgetting that there were just open calls from President Trump on Twitter before he was suspended to have anybody and everybody show up. It wasn't just a specific group that organized one protest and they brought their members there, and that was the extent of, what led to the Capitol siege. I think people are kind of overlooking the degree to which just average everyday people from all over really did descend on DC. There were people that I interviewed there that day was their first Trump rally. They had no group affiliation, no, militia or anything like that. It was just these individual people that heard the call from President Trump and were responding by coming to this rally and coming to this march. Now, that being said, the bulk of the people there then were not participating in the Capitol siege. You had thousands and thousands that were just outside throughout all that. But when you then see this mixed bag of the arrests and how, like you said, 80 to 90% don't even claim any sort of group affiliation, that makes total sense to anybody that was on the ground there and did any interviews with these people. You would notice that it wasn't like, oh, everybody that we interviewed said they were a Proud Boy, or everybody that we interviewed said that they're QAnon, because that just was not the case at all. There was this wide swath of people that all came there, and while you did have some organized groups that also made their way into all this, like the Proud Boys, that tends to be the focus I'm seeing in the media, as opposed to just how broad this really was, and the fact that it's a lot more complex than those singular answers of who organized it, who caused it.
I would add that one thing that I think may have been a little bit forgotten in history is that right ahead of the January 6th situation, Enrique Tarrio posted on Parler telling all of the Proud Boys to not wear Proud Boys uniforms.
Yep,
and so at the previous 2 million MAGA marches, the Proud Boys presence was extremely obvious, right? I mean, they're all wearing basically identical uniforms, maybe some different patches and stuff. But if you're a Proud Boy, people knew you were a Proud Boy, right? That kind of stuff. But on January 5th, on the evening of January 5th, I walked into 4 people who they were wearing sort of like Black Bloc, but each one of them had some kind of American flag somewhere in their body. And it was funny because I tweeted a photo of this. I asked them, can I take a photo of you? And they had all identified themselves to me. Oh, yeah, it's Ford. Hey, we're Proud Boys. And I'm like, oh, that's not how you usually look. And I tweeted this photo, and it was funny. One DC Antifa leader replied to it like, oh, shit, I thought they were actually going to be in Black Bloc. Nobody's going to fall for this. But I think that it's sort of like, not to compare this to the Boston Tea Party, but like with the Boston Tea Party, they dressed up as Native Americans, not because they wanted to blame Native Americans for it, but just to conceal their own identities, right? In this situation, I think that it would be a lot easier to evaluate how much there was a Proud Boys presence if they were labeling themselves, we're Proud Boys, like they do at virtually every other event. And this was among the only times I've seen that they did not do that. And so a couple of them who have been arrested have since been ID'd that way. But I think that part of the reason that the media has not actually focused as much as they probably would have loved to, to tie it to the stand back and stand by and all of that kind of stuff. If those images had shown people in black and golds, I think that the narrative would be very focused on that. Instead, I think the Oath Keepers ended up being the organized group that actually went in a uniformed way, right? Where that's been by far the most licensed image from me was Oath Keepers storming up onto the east side, up the steps and then through the door, and they're all actually wearing Oath Keepers logos and stuff. And Stuart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, was on scene there, right? So the Proud Boys had 2 sort of changes from their usual: no uniforms, and Enrique Tarrio's not there, no leader, right? Oath Keepers, meanwhile, leader is on the ground, and people physically identifying as Oath Keepers and looking like Oath Keepers, but for not having firearms, are kind of on their way in. The other thing that I would just point out about the vibe of the whole thing, and I'm guessing Richie and Brennan will feel similarly, is a lot of people who were there, I felt like didn't have essentially an understanding that what they were doing was illegal. I saw a lot of things like people taking selfies, like with broken glass and so forth. And I think that might have come from a feeling of that Trump has called for or approved of it in some way. But just generally, even interviewing people, some of them are saying things like, we're not believing in using violence. This isn't going to be a violent thing. But, meanwhile, they're literally fighting the police, like in the background as they're having that conversation. So I felt like that could partially be because this was unique. Usually Trump supporters engaged in violence are very specific groups and not the majority of a Trump rally, right? So the Proud Boys are going to walk around after a Trump rally and be like, let's find the left, let's like get into fights or whatever. But for the most part, normal Trump supporters, that basically never happens. And so I think that this was a lot of people who are quite inexperienced in riot. You would never see Antifa protesters not wearing masks taking selfies next to the window that they just broke. It would basically never happen.
Yeah, absolutely. That says it perfectly right there. And the way that you saw some of the crowd respond to like the tear gas and the flashbangs, people were genuinely shocked, some of that. They were not used to these sort of scenarios. You know, for any of us that have been out there reporting on these scenes, it was like, oh, okay, you know, another riot zone. But of course, at the Capitol, that being the unique setting there, for a lot of these people, you could tell they really were just not, they didn't go in necessarily knowing it was going to turn into this riot zone with, you know, tear gas in their faces, bear mace, things like that. And so, you know, I saw a lot of that with it, and it seemed like just the vibe of it, as Ward was describing, was very, very unique. It's hard to really compare it to any of the other events or any other cities that have happened, because you really don't have a scenario where it's just this general mass of people that are all, you know, Trump supporters, like a Trump rally, all going to this at the same time as all these battles with police are happening. And likewise, the level of battling with the police, the level of violence against police was unlike anything I've seen at any of these. I mean, even going back to Portland with the federal courthouse, I think their agents were better poised in fighting back on those. So just seeing how far people were able to get, and just the level of, you know, hitting people with American flags, throwing entire fences at these officers, that really was kind of unparalleled to any other that I'd seen.
Now, just to clarify something, Ford, you were on the east where the Oath Keepers were, and Richie, Brendan, and myself, we were on the west side, because that was the side closest to where the previous march had been.
Right. So yeah, I came in on the, I came through the west side, and then as people started climbing up the wall after they had that fight over the stairs, when the wall climbing was happening, I basically looked at that and was like, no way, man. Like, I'm not going to be able to do that. But I was sort of familiar with the Capitol grounds, so I kind of knew how to loop around and just get to the other side. In my view, I felt at that exact moment like what's going to end up happening is that these people will wrap around to the east side where there's more like entrances, as opposed to the west where it might be more like iconic or something, and it's also the direction people are coming from. But I actually felt like a breach there was less likely. And so I ended up wrapping around to the east, and then I only came around west again once they had physically cleared the Capitol and then started to clear the Capitol grounds. So to people watching this who are not visualizing what we're sort of saying, I ended up on the opposite side as the other three people talking here on this live stream.
And the media pen, from my understanding, the media pen was actually on that east side.
Yeah, and so that was a moment that kind of one of the only moments I felt scared for myself was that some people charged at members of the media in a media pen that's on the sort of east-northeast side of the Capitol. This is an area that, I mean, so I have a Capitol Hill credential. This is an area that normally there's cameras at like quite often, right? This isn't a spot that it's not, these people probably would have been there, you know, protest or not. But basically Trump supporters ended up charging at members of the media who, I'm not sure if any of them were physically injured, but they kind of fled, picking up their cameras and leaving, but with a lot of broadcast equipment left behind, lights, live views, that sort of thing. And the Trump supporters basically picked stuff up and just smashed it in a pile. It felt like a lot longer, but reviewing my footage, the incident was about 3 minutes long of kind of destruction. And I will say, for what it's worth, that some in that crowd were like, what are we, Antifa? We shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be stooping to their level and that kind of thing. But many of them were basically saying, well, the fake news is the enemy and we're the media now and that sort of thing. Ultimately, myself and photographers and other independent journalists weren't attacked. But I have no doubt that if my credential had said CNN instead of News to Share, that I might have had some problems there.
Yeah. Richie, with everything building up, how do you look at the months building up to the Capitol? I'll be honest, I keep reflecting on November the 14th a lot. I review that video. Your team had a lot of footage from November the 14th. And I also asked, well, if Antifa doesn't build this up, do you get the reaction from the Capitol? Now, obviously, that's a huge hypothetical, but it certainly has been something that you think about, which is, did these tactics become viral? You mentioned the media. We were talking about the media pen just now. On January the 7th, I recorded on my website, which is publicreport.org, I have a confession from a guy who I spoke to for about a half hour, and he talks about going down with a bunch of patriots to agitate, his words, the media pen. He said we shook the fences, we destroyed their equipment, they're the fake press, and he openly admits this. But one thing he said that struck me, which was, he said Antifa and BLM showed us that violence works. And that's a quote that I pulled from him, and it's a heavy quote, but there's a lot to unpack with that. But what I attach it to is the tactics. We didn't see guns. We saw pedestrian tactics and sort of, makeshift weaponry leading up to this. Just curious, Richie, what's your reaction to what I just said? And I just threw a lot at you.
Well, I think two things is, number one is what you're seeing on the ground and what you try to capture. I mean, we all know that, you can, when these things are happening in real time, you can only focus your camera on one thing. So you're trying to show that full picture. You're trying to show the context. But what happens is once you capture the footage, the way that it's interpreted by both the press, but also like you were talking about the Twitter to tabloid kind of cycle, certain clips are selectively chosen and then they're retweeted, edited. And so it's never really clear to the actual person on the ground how that's going to be interpreted by, this side or that. So just an example of that was on November 14th, the clip that Trump retweeted of the old man getting kicked over. I was right there, right next to that guy. And I actually was in the process of telling him he had to get out of there or he was going to be in trouble. He gets kicked over. The clip ends, and then I help the guy up. And I'm like dressed with a purple bandana. I look like Antifa. So that's like a narrative breaking instance just visually, where if that full clip was visible, that the picture to somebody who just was looking from the outside would be much different. So I think that's a really good example of how things can be, what's happening on the ground can be decontextualized into these like things that go viral. So I think after November 14th, a lot of what caused the Proud Boys and the MAGA group to turn on law enforcement was two things: the building idea that they weren't going to be able to, change the results of what they deemed to be in their minds an unfair election, and number two, the fact that the footage from that November 14th rally, I think, really, people in MAGA hats getting assaulted in BLM Plaza. I think those clips that were selected and then went viral motivated a lot of people to say exactly what you just said, which is, well, these are their tactics. This is where we're at now. We're going to do it too. When we come back on December 12th, we're going to be ready to fight. And, that just continued the escalation on to January 6th. So I think it's kind of twofold there, which is a distrust in the institutions that kind of caused this election to happen, which they thought was, fraudulent. And then also secondarily, the degree to which they thought law enforcement in D.C. kind of was betraying their safety.
Brendan, how do you characterize the run-up?
Well, if I could add on that, it seemed like there were many that were turning on the DC police specifically because they felt that the police response to BLM protests and ones that had turned violent, ones that had turned to rioting, was not sufficient. They felt that these other things, not just in DC, even like Portland, Kenosha, any of these cities that had rioting, that because law enforcement in many of those instances did not arrest those people or arrested them, but then they were released and the charges dropped, they had this distrust of even the police officers who just a few months prior, they were chanting back the blue. They were, all pro law enforcement, hoping, I suppose, that law enforcement would crack down on some of these things when they saw things like November 14th happen, where really you just had out in the streets, people getting assaulted, people getting pushed over, people getting water and different liquids thrown at them. They felt that basically there was no reason left to trust any of these police officers, that they weren't doing their job of standing in the way of those situations happening. So at that point, they felt more of a sort of desire to take it into their own hands. I remember seeing at the December 12th march, when the Proud Boys were marching past some of the DC police, they were saying, you can go home now, you can go take a break, we got it from here. They were saying things like that directly to the police in a sort of like, we don't really care for what you've been doing these last few months on the streets, so we're going to do our own thing. And I think that, like Richie said, that just escalated then. It started with those November, I mean, obviously, the roots of it were before the election too, but you saw what happened on November 14th. You saw the more active response from these groups like the Proud Boys on December 12th, where they then were charging through and burning the Black Lives Matter banners, things like that, even prior to the election, really not as much of that kind of stuff going on. So and I think that just escalated as things went on. There was also an incident over in Salem, Oregon. Granted, this wasn't a large amount of Proud Boys. It was a rather small group, actually, proportional to what you would see in DC. But there were some clips of that had gone viral, where the Proud Boys clashed with police. They had intervened on a rather small amount of Antifa protesters that had showed up to counter this Proud Boys rally. And police basically did not push against the Antifa-aligned people at all. They only pushed back against the Proud Boys on that day. That was on New Year's Day. And you saw there were some clips of that had gone viral where they were yelling at the police and just, calling them oath breakers. And I think that just naturally led to what you saw when they then fought back against the police in hand-to-hand combat there in Washington, D.C.
By 6 p.m., when people were leaving, there was a strange dichotomy. One group, as they were leaving the Capitol, half the people I heard saying, oath breakers, and then the other half said, thank you for your service. So it was this very strange thing where the crowd was in some sense of more than one mind.
Yeah, I saw that too, sticking around to the end there, right before they had the curfew put in place. It was so bizarre, because, at least when you see like the Black Lives Matter marches or Antifa direct actions, whatever it might be, there's a pretty unified sense, regardless of what the organizations are or who the individuals are, pretty unified idea of anti-police at all of those. So it was really bizarre in DC to see that, where you had some people that were like, oh no, don't hurt them, they're on our side, and other people that were like, no, they're oath breakers, they're not on our side. And this is all happening simultaneously right there. And that went on throughout the afternoon, but became a little bit more easy to focus on later on, closer to 6 p.m. once a lot of the chaos had started to subside.
Now, Brennan, I'm now want to ask you about Portland and what people may or may not know has been continuing ever since the inauguration in Portland, but also Minneapolis. And interestingly enough, if you look at the history of pre-Antifa, which was called anti-racist action, and that framework of organizing, which I have an insider who used to run around in the early 90s with the organizers, the leftists back then. There's this tradition sort of anti-fascism / anti-racism and anarchism going hand in hand. The two sort of flagship cities were Minneapolis and Portland back from the late 80s, where the Baldies in Minneapolis, these were anti-racist skinheads, would go up against neo-Nazi skinheads. And the two hubs were historically Minneapolis and Portland. So it's no coincidence that we're seeing action like we are today. Minneapolis has had, of course, an occupied zone in George Floyd Square that has gone for months, and you see little reported of that. People are asking about Minneapolis coming up. Are any of you coming to Minneapolis next week for the Chauvin trial? Also, Chauvin trial coming up. Are we past the height of protests, or could these be even larger? And this is a complex question, but one I'm curious what your guys' take is. Let's start with you, Brennan, since your footage is the most fresh as far as being amongst actions. When somebody asks that question, where are we? Could these be even larger? How do you respond to that?
It's a little hard to see it going larger than 2020 just because it was so extensive and so massive there. But it's really hard to predict right now because I think there was this misconception amongst many that with Biden's inauguration, that things would stop, that things would slow down. And I think that I see Ford nodding there. I think that some of us that were paying closer attention to the groups themselves and not just the more abstract national level press about it were very much aware that that was not going to be the case, that, they were not thrilled with Biden being inaugurated either, some of these groups, and very much plan to continue demonstrating. And since so much of it is focused on police forces, which are generally localized, I mean, Portland and Seattle have lately been very, very focused on ICE as well and the DHS. But you see things like Minneapolis, where it's the Minneapolis Police Department that's the main focus of the protest there. And that has really nothing to do with who's president at the national level and whether that's a Democrat or Republican. So in terms of, are they going to stop? I definitely don't see that happening, because the incidents that led to these, in many cases, were local, and those kinds of things are, those continue on regardless of what's happening at the national level. In terms of it being larger, that's hard to imagine only because of how huge things were in 2020, but it's really in an unpredictable state right now, I would say.
Ford, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I have a lot on that. So I've been making the same point that Brendan just said, which is that I don't see any real reason to think that a Joe Biden presidency in and of itself means a less unrest filled America. I think that when you think about the people who are participating in street activism, there may be a tendency in the mainstream media to try to tie them essentially to normal people who vote. But people who are out there on the street are more in the extremities of politics. They're not, nobody was going out there like, I'd take a bullet for Jeb Bush, right? So we're talking about people who are strapping up firearms and so forth to oppose their Democratic governors. And we're talking about people who, dressing in black bloc and whatever to oppose Trump. But those people are not necessarily fans of their respective parties, and they're definitely not going to be satisfied with the Biden presidency. For the far left, Biden is he passed the criminal justice bill in 1992, right? His foreign policy doesn't leave much to be thrilled about among the further left. And for Trump supporters, Biden being there, I think that there's been an argument in the media that Trump kind of enables people, which might be true to some extent. But the right-wing demonstrations that were not explicitly pro-Trump, for example, the entering of the Capitol in Michigan that occurred, that sort of thing is really more unified around opposition to Democratic state leadership. And viewed through that lens, a Joe Biden presidency may, if anything, actually give those conservatives more to be upset about. I think there are only two factors that I'm kind of aware of that would make there be, less of this sort of activity this year. Number one, I do think that losing train of thought. Oh, sorry. I think that there's been a dampening effect since January 6th itself, where the FBI has been going and knocking on the doors of a lot more people. So, first of all, people are getting, arrested for participation in January 6th, which I think is causing some on the right to say, wow, shit, this can actually happen to us too. And I've actually been covering, I think I've covered 4 Boogaloo rallies, armed, I guess I would call them extremist libertarian, not particularly pro-Trump nor leftist, but just anti-government. And pretty much without exception, every one of those people who I've interviewed has described getting an FBI visit since January 6th. And none of them even like Trump. They just based on, we're taking actual, armed activism against the Capitol, insurrectionary language, that sort of thing is attracting more interest from the feds, might be a dampening effect on the right. And I have also seen on the ground, I was in the state of Washington recently for a conservative rally where I actually saw 2 people who I've independently confirmed are both Republicans accuse each other of being Antifa. One because he was wearing a mask and therefore he must be Antifa. The other thing was that he had a pistol on his side, and they had said, we don't want to look militant at this event, so don't show up with a gun. Guy shows up with a gun and wearing a mask. people kind of raised their eyebrows at him. And then that guy was accusing the other person of being an anti-fascist on the basis of he's filming. And if you're filming people's faces, you're trying to dox people, and you must be a leftist. The person who he accused actually was a 2-time Republican nominee for a state rep position. So both people, and then the individual who had the mask has a program online where he actually he says in his description on YouTube that he is a Republican commentator. So I think there's a little bit of paranoia about law enforcement infiltration and that sort of thing, which could be a dampening effect. And then I think on the left, the equivalent would be that I think it may be, while the issues are not going to be satisfied, Antifa is not happy with Joe Biden. Antifa is not going to be happy with his positions. There's no reason to think police violence would go down under his presidency, all of that. At the same time, it's probably easier for Antifa to recruit during a Trump presidency that is going to anger people who I guess I would say are left of center and on the fence about doing street activism. It's probably harder to convince people to do that during Trump or during Biden than during Trump. Although I think their enemy is going to remain Trump supporters, right? The actual MAGA movement is not going anywhere. And so they will continue to have enemies both in the government where, PG is going to see, people fighting ICE, I guess, is probably what's happening in Portland for the most part. That doesn't go away during Biden. Biden's certainly not abolishing ICE. I'll take that prediction to the bank.
I'll second that one.
Yeah. But on the other hand, they may find it harder to recruit when it's not the, orange man in the presidency.
Richie, how do you see it?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Just in terms of the fact, it's also not an election year. You don't have the orange man. So while that kind of impetus for kind of average everyday people to get out into the streets, also this pandemic is tailing down. I think a lot of the underpinning kind of just general societal angst that was happening last year has dissipated. But like we said earlier, I had a clip go viral in Philly in the riots that took place there in October, and it was one of the activists there. Actually, just minutes before they started a different group started looting a Walmart miles away from there. But she just said, so you guys think that if we get the author of the crime bill and the top cop into the White House, all of our problems are just going to go away? Are you guys idiots? Because basically what she was saying is that, people manifesting their problems into this orange man bad, got to get rid of Trump and then everything will be okay kind of idea is false. And ultimately, Biden is an institutionalist. And so, while Trump is more of a populist, I think on the left, Biden isn't the savior of any of their problems in the criminal justice system, because I don't think, his history doesn't really prove that he's going to address those problems.
I think also, as long as the media gives cover for outrage, again, from Twitter, this sort of outrage that builds and then carries over and is legitimized time and time again, each of these situations, we have to remember, there's going to be some sort of trial coming up with each, whether it's in Atlanta with Ahmaud Arbery, whether it's in Minneapolis with the death of George Floyd. Now we have, and if we look back to where this started, which was Ferguson and St. Louis with the Michael Brown, you had several riots one after another, because you had the announcement of, whenever you have the announcement that somebody won't be charged, or in the case of George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, where the charges exceeded, he was let off, and they were argued. I'm not saying I have an opinion on this, but what was argued was that the charges exceeded, did not show, they could not prove intent, and he was let off. Are we going to have situations like that? It's quite possible. For example, in Minneapolis is one of the, and Minnesota is one of the states that has a third-degree murder charge. And Keith Ellison, who is in charge of that prosecution of Chauvin, upped it from third degree to second degree. Well, that's exactly what happened with George Zimmerman. He was initially charged with more of a manslaughter charge of third-degree murder, and it was upped to second degree. Well, in second degree, you have to show that there was an intent to kill. Now we get into muddied legal waters, where if this is not parsed and talked about in a deliberate manner in the general public, then there's a hole for exploitation, which is you can pitch this again as another reason to burn things down and go after, quote unquote, the racist system. So I think we're in really treacherous waters whenever the media hitchhikes, they're hop-ons. They just hop on board and get behind whatever is going to rage trend. And as long as we're rage trending and rage parroting and not having more moderate conversations about what's actually going on and how we can move towards reform, whether it's police reform, whether it's prison reform, any of these issues that even you could say in a reform, but reform isn't enough. That's the thing. There will always be the sector that wants to abolish. No police, no prisons, no presidents. That's what we've seen out of the Antifa-aligned groups, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where Brendan was. Just really quick, Boogaloo. How do you characterize Boogaloo? We all nodded at the same time when Ford mentioned Boogaloo. I use almost unaffiliated or third-party extremism or some sort of, but anarcho-libertarian is sort of another way you can describe it. But I think what people don't understand, because this is another point that was exploited so consistently from publications of the left, because they wanted to say far-right people with guns.
Yeah,
Look,
Wikipedia changed.
Right.
Wikipedia says far-right now. On
Really?
Really?
Yeah.
I don't even use the term far right anymore or far left, or because they're not so far away. This seems like these are populist. This is populist fanaticism, and if it's on Twitter, it's not that far left or far right. It's right in front of our faces. That's how I kind of see it.
So I've been spending a lot of time covering Boogaloos over the last year in general, but especially actually in the last month following January 6th. To kind of clarify, I think their political positions, they are somewhat politically diverse. I would say that most of them that I have met are from the political right. Not to say that they consider themselves now to be on the political right, but most of them, it's been kind of like a disaffected with Republican or conservative politics, which then pushed them in a libertarian direction, but with the kind of militia garb. I actually interviewed somebody recently who he was wearing a mask in Atlanta at a Boogaloo rally, but I recognized him instantly as someone who I had filmed at a 3% event in 2019. And I interviewed him about, basically what changed? You're a Boogaloo now, and before you were with a far-right militia. And he was like, well, I was a libertarian both times. I felt like the problem with them is that they were basically pro-Trump. And in his mind, his primary thing was that he was against tyranny as it relates to firearms. He was like, he was a 2A absolutist, 100% all gun laws infringements, whatever. And he was saying he did not like that there was apologism on the Trump side for example, the bump stock ban. The example he gave me is he goes, I know bump stocks are stupid, but if President Trump wanted to sign an executive order that said it's illegal to paint a purple unicorn on your firearm, he goes, I would want to fight a revolution against that. Like, he's like, and no matter how dumb it is, people have the right to carry whatever they want to, and that's kind of what drove them in. It also carries some level of overlap, I guess, with the left. And so I think this is what's been really complicated and why there's been a lot of both sides trying to push the Boogaloos onto each other. What I've found is that the groups that ally with the Boogaloos tend to sort of see them as independent. We realize that these are a situational ally to us. So I once in Ohio filmed a situation where Proud Boys started off the day with the Boogaloos because they were all, and other conservatives, who were all about no COVID restrictions, right? The government is infringing on our right to not wear a mask and open our coffee shops. And later in that day, Black Lives Matter and Antifa protesters showed up to that situation, and the Boogaloos basically switched sides. They went to defend that side because that side was carrying sort of an anti-police message, and they felt like the Proud Boys were posturing for more of like a fight. And so their alliance was really easily fractured. They started off the day with the right. They ended up literally fist fighting with right-wing people because of the changed kind of alignment of what the day ended up being about, what people were actually arguing about, which ended up largely being police. Similarly, I mean, it was a week ago that when I filmed the Boogaloo rally in Atlanta, it was an abolish ICE protest. And so that actually had two self-described anti-fascists at it. But what was interesting was online, there were a lot of leftists replying to me claiming that basically this is just performative, that they probably are fascists, they're probably racist, they probably support ICE, but they must have had an abolish ICE protest just for the PR of it. I don't want to opine too much or kind of like add, I guess my own feeling, but it didn't seem to me that anyone there was ingenuine. There was the one guy, the former 3%er dude seemed, I will say, a little uncomfortable with some of the chants about abolishing ICE. And when he actually spoke, he focused very narrowly on a specific human rights violation that allegedly occurred there, which was forced hysterectomies. And so I think even most conservatives, even the most diehard Trump supporters, would probably tell you that forced hysterectomies of migrant women is bad. I think most Trump supporters would say that. So this individual, also there, I did not see any reason to believe that the people who were there did not genuinely have anti-ICE beliefs. I think that you kind of just have to be able to say they're anti-government, and Republicans and Democrats both are their own flavor of government. And so trying to align the Boogaloos with either side, I think, is mostly a dead end. What's interesting is that it's usually both sides accuse the Boogaloo of being the other side. I see a lot of right-wingers say the Boogaloos are just Antifa with guns. When I've posted even to my own audience has gone, that's just Antifa wearing, colorful shirts. And similarly, the Proud Boys at this point, I've heard very frequently refer to the Boogaloos that way. But then the left goes, oh, the Boogaloos are just fascists that are trying to not look like fascists. So it's complicated.
It is complicated, and there's all kinds of regional differentiation. Brendan, what do you see, being from the upper Midwest? I'm sure there's you have your own flavor of how, first of all, with the presence of guns being open carry, how do you make heads or tails when you have new groups with guns showing up?
Yeah, it is a little hard to tell at first because with Michigan, they're just so common at so many of those protests at the Capitol, and actually even elsewhere in Michigan, Grand Rapids and other cities, that you'll have just individual people totally unaffiliated that show up with guns. You'll have people that are part of, like a specific militia or a specific group. Proud Boys have showed up with those. And then you have this Boogaloo. And they show up at various different events. So it's really hard to categorize them as only this or only that. It's really complex. It's one of those things where you have to try to talk to some of these individuals to get a better sense. Trying to just tell from afar is really, really difficult because you just see somebody with a gun, but their uniform doesn't exactly give anything away specifically at first, because the gun might make you at first think right wing, but then you see some of them will have Black Lives Matter patches on. So it's like, okay, well, that's definitely not a general right wing position to openly espouse that on a uniform. And you'll see some of them will have like a pride flag, rainbow pride flag. So that also then is more aligning with the left. So I think really Ford said it best with just anti-government seems to be a common theme no matter where you see them, whether it was in Michigan where I think encountered them the most times, but also seeing them in Virginia or elsewhere where it was like this sense of we're here for when it all falls apart. Like they're there for this sort of post-civilization, or civilization might be a little bit too broad, but like government, like if the government were to fall apart, or if there were to be fractures within the United States, like serious fractures, that there would have to be some sort of like citizen uprising of some kind. And that seems to be a little bit more aligned with what they've been presenting as, or what they've been sort of demonstrating for. I know in Michigan, they seem to say as much, that sort of like these politicians are not solving our problems, and if they keep acting up, like it may be up to the people, that sort of thing, that sort of message.
I would add just on Michigan Boogaloos that out of the 13 people who had a plot to allegedly kidnap the governor, one of the, I think most people would refer to that as a far-right plot, and I think that would be probably a fair label. But precisely one of those people actually did identify as a boogaloo and had at one point referred to themselves as a left anarchist on Twitter. So I think it shows the malleability of that kind of anti-government philosophy, where someone who is anti-government and then happens to have some leftist beliefs about either race or capitalism or something is still able to then align with right-wing militias as it relates to an opposition to a Democratic governor.
Richie, what are your thoughts?
I definitely, I mean, it's complicated for exactly those reasons that you guys just listed. And I think that's obviously a much more nuanced conversation that we just had than any of the discourse that I've seen anywhere in like corporate media over the entire last year. So, I mean, with that being said, I also think, historically speaking, we're currently in a time where both the left and the right are questioning the institutions that, were built in America. And the way in which that manifests itself on the political right and left is different. But, Donald Trump clearly captured a lot of anti-establishment, anti-institutional themes that I think that the ideological left hasn't really, at least in terms of representation in our mainstream political parties, hasn't captured. So I think the fact that we're seeing these kind of groups spring up where the classical definitions that we have for political affiliations are really upended. And that's just demonstrated by the fact that, I mean, generally speaking, we associate the institutions that we have being preserved, with the ideological right. But then you have Donald Trump walks in and tries to smash a lot of those traditionally kind of conservative values. So I think we're in this moment in history where nobody really knows like what news they should trust, what political parties are representative of what they think is important. And as a result, there's a lot more noise that you have to cut through in order to define why people are doing the things that they're doing. Because it's not like, oh, you're a union Democrat. You've been voting the same for the last 40 years because you're in a union. That all of that is being kind of upended right now.
And we're trying to figure out, this is an interesting question. From your own observations, what percentage of the boogaloos would you venture to guess have violent tendencies? Proud Boys, Antifa, would you describe their violence as indiscriminate? Well, I mean, that's kind of a general question, but I think I know what he's trying to get at is who should we really be worried about here? And you say you don't know who to trust when it comes to media outlets. Well, I think people can trust us because we've experienced it, we've seen it. So I think what people are looking for is some kind of impression as to how dangerous of a time are we living in, which groups concern you, and how would you characterize tendencies towards violence? I would say one particular group seems to be pretty regular with how they're operating and pretty predictable, and maybe it's the unpredictable that's more frightening, because I certainly did not expect what happened on January 6th to happen. I think I've had various conversations with you guys, each individually, that I got there late. I thought I was going to have to go till 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. because as we saw on November 14th and as we saw on December the 12th, these volleys between the Antifa-aligned groups in Black Bloc and the sort of after-dark Trump supporters that were mostly Proud Boys led, those could go late. And so I wasn't showing up early to see the president speak or anything like that because I thought I had a long day ahead of me. So I certainly think what surprises us can show itself as potentially the most sensational or violent. But how would you characterize these different groups, Ford?
Okay, so out of those three groups, I think that the violence or potential for violence is kind of just different in flavor. So to use a kind of academic term, there was actually a page of a book about Charlottesville that quotes me describing this. And so in academic terms, Antifa tends to prefer basically property destruction, which it depends on whether or not you would call that violence. I will offer that some people believe that property destruction is not violence, and Antifa would generally carry that belief. And they also tend to use stealth violence, meaning that they will, wear masks and, one or two of them go and engage in some kind of a an attack, and then they're able to mix back in with the crowd, and so it's sort of a small scale whatever, right? So I have been in countless situations where Antifa does what I guess I would call small attacks individually, that there is not the ability to have kind of individually who did this. I think that probably the quintessential example that everybody's familiar with is, and the people who attacked Andy No have not been identified because they were able to exploit that tactic. The Proud Boys do not, for the most part, engage in property violence, although that did change in the final sort of 2 months that we're talking about, where they burned the banner from the church and were destroying Black Lives Matter art, and then, participated in the Capitol siege. But for the most part, their violence has not been based on property. And in language, whether in practice or not, at least in language, they tend to use what would academically be referred to as escalation dominance. This is the idea that the Proud Boys are generally going to, at least in theory, not start the fight, but they will intentionally get into a situation fully prepared for the fight, and then when somebody else starts the fight, they escalate it. And so rather than hiding behind, you can't tell it was me because I was wearing a mask, they have the fact of being able to say, oh, they punched first. And that's easier for them to sort of escape having that kind of issue of prosecution or whatever. Again, that has kind of changed in the last couple of months, where the Proud Boys engaged in a lot more initiatory violence and a lot more property destruction than I've really seen them ever do. The Boogaloos, I have mostly not seen get into physical fights on the ground. I have seen on a couple of occasions them fight with Proud Boys, which I would say is partially is a combination of them trying to stress their opposition to groups like Proud Boys, and also just the nature of the Proud Boys themselves to get into that kind of situation. But as opposed to those other two groups, where I'm not actually aware of any high number of Proud Boys or Antifa-related murders, there were 4 at least vaguely Boogaloo-related killings of law enforcement in the year 2020. And I think when you listen to the values that all 3 of these groups talk about, Antifa is saying we're opposition by any means necessary to tyrannical government. They believe they're forming kind of existential anti-violence, even if it's through violence to get there. The Proud Boys, nationalism and so forth, and then like self-defense kind of violence, whatever. The Boogaloos are the only of the 3 that actually, in some cases, describe initiatory or insurrectionist violence. None of these groups would normally say, oh, we're going to burn the government down, and we literally plan on doing that. The Boogaloos will talk about there could come a day where they would actually engage in insurrectionary violence, talking about what kinds of targets would be legitimate in the case of some kind of a guerrilla war, that sort of stuff. So I haven't seen it on the ground. Out of the 3, they're the ones that I've seen by far the least violence physically, but in terms of what they actually talk about as an ideology, they are certainly the most acclimated to discussing violence as an aspect of their ideology.
Wow. What's your perception, Brendan?
Yeah, likewise. It seems with Boogaloo, there aren't huge numbers, at least not that come out to these rallies. You'll never, at least up until now, I haven't seen any sort of showing of 1,000 Boogaloo or 1,000 rallying anywhere. And so trying to pinpoint exact numbers, that's difficult. And I think that has meant that the discussions have been very much, I don't want to say accepting to violence, but definitely like aware that it may come to that, aware that they may, as Ford said, at some point take up those, and not even just, the smaller level, like window smashing, those kind of tactics, but like full on insurrectionist tactics. But in terms of what's actually taken place on the streets and what's actually going on, really generally doesn't happen, other than occasionally they'll get into some like verbal confrontations with people that are confused. Usually it's people that are confused on who they are or what their purpose is there. In terms of what's been reported, I haven't personally witnessed these incidents, but like Ford said, there were a couple instances where law enforcement officers were killed by Boogaloo affiliated people. Each of those incidents, I'm sure, has different nuances to it, but that shows you that definitely there is a part of it that's prone to violence, or at least aware that violent tactics may be used at some point. generally when they come out to these rallies, that kind of stuff doesn't happen from what I've seen. It's complicated. It's really, really complicated. In terms of some of the other groups, it has changed. It really has evolved. I remember covering some of those Proud Boys rallies, like when they would come to Portland back in August, and like was previously stated, they would sort of be there as a presence, waiting for something else to provoke it, so that they could respond. And that happened very frequently, where you would see somebody on any of the Antifa line side that was out there opposing them. They would come to their rallies to oppose them, may throw something, or somebody gets hit with something, whatever, and then that's sort of the justification to then respond, not even just in kind, but sometimes even more aggressively. So that was how it was back in the summer. As you saw things progress months, and I think this kind of goes hand in hand with the feeling that law enforcement was not intervening when they were hoping they would, because back in the summer they still were very pro law enforcement, at least publicly in their messages. I'm sure privately many probably were discussing otherwise, but you saw generally they would align with the pro law enforcement groups or individuals. And as the months went on, and you saw just time and time again, especially in the Northwest, where people are arrested but the charges dropped, or they're just never arrested at all. Property damage or assaults on the street go on, and nobody's found, and nobody's ever charged. And I think that as that went on, it has then escalated in some of those groups to where they're more willing to instigate and more willing to go out and be the first to then grab a banner down from, in DC, when they were grabbing those banners down from churches or from the union buildings that would have a Black Lives Matter banner on there, where like specifically that was unprovoked, other than more generally they felt provoked from what had happened in the months and weeks leading up to that.
Richie, who worries you?
Well, I think all of them would be the short answer, and for all the reasons that we just discussed. And I would agree that the Boogaloos are kind of the least prone to violence, like happening right before you, but the ones who are the most likely to entertain ideas of what they would do if, for example, the police try to confiscate their weapons, and specifically what the course of action would be from there. The other thing I think that's important is that I'm reading like Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail in 1970. Or sorry, no, I'm reading Hell's Angels right now. Sorry, I'm reading two different ones. But he was talking about how the Hell's Angels in the early 1960s were around 100 people, and after Newsweek and all these major media outlets came out with profiles on them, their numbers grew exponentially. And so I think we saw that happen with Antifa kind of right after Trump was elected in 2017, this rise in, everyone in the media is saying that Antifa is anti-Trump. I think that's cool. And then, CNN talking about the Proud Boys after the debate in October. And then all of a sudden these people are like, wait, CNN says the Proud Boys are terrible. I want to be a Proud Boy. And I think something similar is happening to the Boogaloos too, which is just like national attention being drawn to these groups actually amplifies their constituency, because they become kind of a household name, something that's, that people view to be active participants in, the direction of where our culture and where our civil discourse is going. So I think all of that combined with the fact that none of these three groups really have anywhere to hang their hat on right now. Like, we talked about how Antifa still really, nothing's satisfied by the fact that Kamala and Joe are in the White House now. And we talked about how obviously Trump is out. And the Boogaloo Boys, I think they'll have a mistrust for institutions until there aren't any. So all of that combined with the fact that there's so much more attention being applied to this, civil discourse being, covered by the press, and also the groups that are participating in it being either villainized or lionized by one side or the other. I think that's kind of a recipe for it to boil up further as we proceed.
If they could all just do their own thing and sort of, hold their protests or do their, but I would say there is one group of the three that we mentioned that tends to not want to let the other groups mobilize. And that goes back to a saying, which was, we go where they go. And this is anti-racist action the precursor to anti-fascist action. That's what it was called in Europe. Antifa was anti-fascist action. They called it anti-racist action here, and they formed a network in the late 80s. And they called it that because they thought in the late 80s, well, people aren't going to be able to relate to being anti-fascist. What is that even? We'll call it anti-racist action. But we go where they go and do not give them the chance to mobilize, to organize. Do not give them the space to organize. Those were the old credos of the leftists from the late 80s into the 90s. And I think we still see that to some extent, where if it was MAGA or if it was Proud Boys, those groups would be opposed at their own rallies consistently throughout 2020. If there was a MAGA rally, that was not allowed to stand in certain regions. So when I go into these crowds, who am I worried about taking me out or coming after me? I'm not worried about MAGA people. I'll be honest, I haven't been, I think at first, because there was so much in the media, I was live streaming from a Proud Boys rally. It was that one in September in Portland. And people on my Facebook were like, "You're crazy. What are you doing? Be careful." And I'm just looking around like, it's just, these guys are just drinking beer and I don't know what they're like, them by themselves. What am I supposed to get worked up about? But it's only when the other group comes in to start something that I started to realize, but look, I don't want to generalize because again, there's regional variation, there's different circumstances that will buck that. But I will say, as far as my personal safety, people ask me, were you worried about your personal safety at the Capitol? I was not. The situation I have to be most worried about is a Antifa-aligned mob in black bloc turning against me in the middle of me filming. Because in that culture, you are not allowed to film people. You get an umbrella in your face, you get this and that. Now, as all four of us have been out there actually doing that, it may be that my sort of perception is colored by that stance of, well, I'm a target because I am filming. But it seems to me, who is most likely to attack their fellow man? And when I ask myself that question, I will say this. I mean, when we talked about the Boogaloo, Stephen Carrillo is from my area, San Francisco Bay Area. He was an active Air Force staff sergeant who killed 2 officers, a federal officer and a deputy in the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's. So obviously the potential for fatalities increases when you have more guns and people with more extreme and maybe operating from personal despair. That's where it gets extremely muddied. Who's the platform insurrectionists? Who are the ones who really want to go against the government, and who are the ones who want to go against their fellow man if they do not think exactly like them? And those are the questions that I ask when I try to parse a proposition like that as to who is the most violent. Now, if I'm saying I'm looking out for myself, then I know where my answer is. Go ahead, Ford.
So I've noted each of Richie and BG have used one use of the term nuance. So I'm going to use my one nuance card here.
Yeah, one per.
Yeah. So you referenced the September event in Portland of the Proud Boys, and I was at the same event. And at the same event that you described not being concerned at, I witnessed on a couple of occasions media be basically physically removed. In one case, they were, somebody basically pulled their camera off of them and threw it, stuff like that. And I actually had, I think I would say, almost the false impression that couldn't happen to me. And the reason I say that is the people who were assaulted in that way were ostensibly leftist people. One of them had openly leftist beliefs. The other had an IWW. To people who don't know that, it's International Workers of the World, which they have a freelance journalists union, but I mean it's a leftist union, so that badge tends to denote leftism among the people wearing it. But I was approached by a member of a apparent militia group that was providing security there, and others sort of swarmed around him to his support. And he went up to me and said, "I have intelligence that you're Antifa." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And this conversation went on, and I ended up filming it. I missed the very beginning of it because I had not been filming when he approached me, and then I, basically put a camera on. And he goes on to describe that he has some sort of intelligence that suggests that I'm Antifa. And so I'll circle back to what he probably got in a sec. But basically, I was insisting, first of all, you're acting the way that Antifa, you believe that they act, which is physically threatening somebody to make them leave, right? He was approaching me to say, "We're forcing you to leave this public park right now." And upon me saying, first of all, you're wrong about me. Second of all, this is a public place. You can't stop me from filming here, just constitutionally speaking. And he wasn't buying it. And so I'm like, okay, how about this? This is a Proud Boys rally, right? And he goes, "No, it's not." And right after that, right as he says that, a Proud Boy comes up behind him and it goes, "Hey, it's Ford, proud of your boy." And I'm like, okay, this is probably not helping me among my leftist viewers, but it did make that guy look like a real doofus, so I was okay with it. But I go, how about this? This is a Proud Boys event. Find Enrique Tarrio or Joe Biggs, and if they agree that I'm Antifa, I'll leave. And finally, at first he's like, "No, I'm the authority. I'm making you leave." And then finally he goes, "Okay, fine. As soon as we talk to Enrique, you're gone." And we go up to Enrique. I explain the thing. Yeah, he thinks I'm Antifa. And Enrique goes, "That's probably because you are." "Just kidding. He's a cool independent journalist. Stop giving him shit." And later in the event, actually, because this was happening so often, so many journalists had been attacked at that specific event, Joe Biggs ultimately went on the stage. To people who don't know, Joe Biggs is a fairly prominent Proud Boys aligned person who's at basically all of their events. And Biggs says, "Hey guys, stop hassling the media. This is America. We might not like what they say, but blah, blah, blah." I mean, basically your normal First Amendment kind of argument, which I very much appreciated him doing. What probably happened, the reason that this person probably thought this, is that IGD, which is It's Going Down, this is basically an Antifa news publication, they blocked me on Twitter, so I wasn't actually able to see that this had happened. But after I had tweeted some images from that protest, they apparently took one of the pictures, reposted it, and then actually credited me on it, like photo by Ford Fischer, which I think to an uninformed person, they might believe that I had somehow collaborated with IGD. Meanwhile, I had no idea this was happening. Obviously, I wasn't just scrolling through Twitter, but either way, I was actually blocked by them. So I had no idea that this had gone on until after. But that misperception, Ford's Antifa, caused a person with a gun to approach me and say, "You need to leave this place," and that verbal altercation to take place for 7 minutes. So I hate to say it, but I do think that there has been rhetoric that on the left, it's, "Oh, you might be doxing us," or "your right-wing press," no streamers, all of that kind of stuff can sometimes happen. That it is certainly true that there can be anti-press sentiments among the far left. But there has also been a great distrust of the fake news, leftist news, Antifa press, that sort of thing, which, although I would say that it hasn't happened as often, the real possibility of violence was there. And then on January 6th, I mean, they did attack mainstream journalists. And again, not myself, but I don't think that distinction is anywhere rooted in logic, right? There's no reason that a CNN cameraman should be attacked just because you don't like what is published on the network called CNN.
BG, are you mistaken for Antifa at times? I should have said at the beginning that all of us maintain our independence, I think, pretty well in what we do. And that's why I wanted to talk to all three of you, all four of us talk at the same time, is because I think we both in our own ways maintain our autonomy and fairness when it comes to getting material out. But certainly I know that I've been in this situation where I've been called Antifa, and then the very opposite has happened, where I've been attacked on the other side. So BG, how do you characterize it?
Likewise, it's happened on both sides. I would say more frequently you'll see the accusations of like against conservative or like you're a right wing press or something like that. But likewise, there's been times where I've covered a more right wing event, and that had people accusing me of being Antifa, and so it goes both ways. There's this distrust of, on the right, it seems more like distrust of media, mainstream media, that sort of thing. On the left aligned ones, it's more specifically, oh, we don't want streamers, we don't want people filming people's faces. It's a lot more individualized, I would say. Whereas on the right, when you see it, it's a bit more of a broad, like, we don't want people putting out fake narratives, that sort of thing. So yeah, so I've definitely faced that sort of harassment, intimidation on both sides from it. And it is, it's a difficult thing to deal with all of this, because when you're just trying to report independently and just report accurately what's going on a variety of things. One thing that I've noticed too, for people when if they individualize you and single you out, oh, you're BG on the scene, oh, you were at this event and you covered this event, and because of that, you must be part of this group. And that actually just happened to me recently. I was going to cover what was essentially a pro-Black Lives Matter protest. It was actually a nuanced local incident in Grosse Pointe Park where a resident had put up a KKK flag, and so people were out protesting in response to that. So, generally a pro-Black Lives Matter march there, and somebody had surrounded me, called me out, and said, "Oh, you were at the Capitol filming. You were at the Capitol filming. You're," and calls me out for all of this, and it ultimately prevented me from covering a good chunk of the march by just having me surrounded by the security detail and just harassing me for having did it. And I challenged him and I said, so basically, because I go and I covered an event you didn't like, you're angry that I'm covering this event too. Because really, these are two events kind of on the opposite spectrum. One of them was a very right-wing event. This one, I would argue, left-wing, if it's, pro-Black Lives Matter. And those kind of nuanced arguments are just difficult, I guess, for some on the ground to accept. They want press that either only covers the Black Lives Matter and Antifa type stuff, or only is out at the conservative events, and so they can be trusted amongst those people and that sort of thing. When you have the few individuals like ourselves here that cover both, it actually creates a very unique complication, because you'll get those accusations from both sides simply for the mere presence of having covered these other events. And it leads, and then it leads to situations like what Ford had mentioned, where then just because it just reaches then such wide audiences, all of a sudden something is shared by, this group or by this person, and then people assume there's some association there. I know my stuff personally is very, very often cited in right-leaning press and stuff like that, but it's also been at times, especially when it was coverage of stuff like the Proud Boys, cited on left-wing accounts and accounts that are specifically out trying to target people. And when you have those things happening on both sides, it gives ammunition for both sides then to counter and say, oh, you're helping this group, you're part of this group, you must be this association, you must have these beliefs, when in reality you're actually just out reporting the truth from any of these events.
And Richie, I'm assuming that you are assumed to be on one side, as we have all had this sort of situation where people seem to think it's a lost art that you would cover both sides fairly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for us, the Daily Caller is perceived to be a conservative website. As for the people on my team, Jorge and Shelby, who are out there actually covering these protests, I don't think any of us would consider ourselves to be conservatives. But certainly, if the Antifa types find out about where we work, that's a much more threatening situation than, if the Proud Boys find out where we work. But with that being said, I had an instance, I made the mistake of bringing a skateboard on December 12th so I could get quickly between the two groups downtown. And I had probably got called a skateboard bitch like 100 times by Proud Boys that day, just because of the way that I looked. And, then if they found out where I worked, then they'd say, well, the interesting thing to me there was that they'd say, we don't care that you work there. All the press is fake press. And I think that really kind of really illustrates the degree to which their cause became more and more desperate as time went on, and the degree to which they they trusted who, were formerly their allies, in law enforcement and in the media as time went on. And I will say, we got like beat up in Wauwatosa pretty badly by police. And obviously BG was right there, and you can see on the video BG getting tossed to the ground like very physically violently. And so I think that was interesting for Shelby and I, because we're calling it like we see it. If there's an instance where law enforcement uses excess force, we're not going to come out and say, stand on a soapbox and say, this is the problem with law enforcement. We'll show people what happened. We'll show them what happened to us. And while you don't want to make yourself part of the story, I think secondarily that just goes to show the degree to which these kind of two different echo chambers have expectations for details that you should and should not include, regardless of their viewpoint is not that, our role as journalists is to play it down the middle and just try our best to, objectively tell everything that's going on, cops beating up protesters and vice versa. So I think definitely now more than 2, 3, 5 years ago, that's much more difficult line to toe.
I even get pushback for bringing up just what I saw as tactical similarities between what I saw on January the 6th and the tactics that had been developed that come from insurrectionary anarchism, basically, the Black Bloc tactics. They go all the way back to Germany in the 80s and the WTO riot in Seattle in 1999. And when I start talking about how these tactics are shared and how you have different populist groups using them, even saying those two things in the same sentence, I get told I'm presenting dangerous content of some sort just by trying to address that. I mean, that's the hard part with this is that I have been told by good friends that I'm either on one side of history or I'm not. And how can I possibly do a good job if I approached it from that angle? Because then I would be constantly censoring and opening and closing the floodgates as to what I deem appropriate to post. And what I've always found, I think what's great that we're having this conversation, and what I've always found great about all of your work is you tell it like it is and you show it. And we needed more of that this year. And my feeling is we just didn't get enough of it.
If I could add something on that, I think I've sometimes seen a criticism where people will say Ford is trying to be neutral. And I think I've seen the same criticism of BG. And the criticism says something like, neutrality is basically taking a side with whoever's bad. And the thing that I would point out is I do not refer to myself as neutral. I don't think of myself as neutral. The term that I try to use, or what I think we should strive to, is objectivity. And so for me, neutrality is a statement of the equivalence of positions or taking a stance of apathy, as opposed to simply not taking a stance, right? So if you have a neo-Nazi protest and then you have people counter-protesting those people, neutrality would be to suggest that the two sides are equally valid. And I actually think that CNN, for example, actually falls into this much more than independent press tends to, where CNN will, rather than just telling you something that happened or just literally showing you, here's the thing, right, here's the Trump speech, they'll say, well, we have this Democratic consultant, and on the other side, we have Rick Santorum, and they're going to argue for 7 minutes about what you just saw, and since we've got someone on the right and someone on the left, this must be truth, right? So I see that maybe as neutral, but it's definitely not an objective telling of the story. It's just telling you two options of what you can think about it, rather than simply one option, which would be like biased. And so what I strive toward is showing what happens without making any statement of the value, correctness, whatever, making any kind of value judgment on the people in it. I for example, I'm perfectly comfortable with saying, being not racist is much better than being racist. I'm very comfortable being quoted saying that. But in the context of like while filming something, I will literally just quote, this is the thing the person said, and I'm not using language like this is the racist side, they are bad. This is the anti-racist side, they are good. Exactly. And I think that if people actually think that you need to label things like that, like it's not giving enough credit to an audience that when you show someone something that happens that they can actually look at that and determine it for themselves. People shouldn't need me to say the Nazis are bad when I cover what they are doing and simply describe this is what they're doing.
That's been such a big focus of what I've done and why I've tried to center around the video and showing video what's going on. Let the video speak for itself, because the video is presenting real things that are going on, as opposed to simply the captioning that then allows for more, crafting of a narrative and trying to push people towards, one belief or this. And, I feel like just presenting of facts, presenting of information, and allowing the audience to make their judgments and their decisions and their calls based off of that is being a lot more responsible than, there's always going to be room for the opinion, on the left and the right and whatnot. But I think that there has been this missing of people that will just go out there and simply present the information of what's happening and allow people then to, make their judgments based off of that. When the only information you're getting is the already packaged, the already biased, infused, whatever you want to call it, that sort of news segment, that makes it really difficult to then sort of take it back a couple steps and try to figure out, okay, what was the original thing that happened? What led to this sensational headline that I'm seeing? And so what I focus on with my work, and I think Ford falls into the same category, is focusing on the original, here's what's going on, here's what was happening, as opposed to just at the end of the day, we wrote down, oh, Nazis gathered in the park, or something like that, to where it immediately is pushing people towards, one line of thinking without just simply presenting that information as it was sort of presented to us being there on the scene and reporting on it. And I think that level of objectivity, or, I refer to it as just independence, is really important to what I always, when I was growing up, like as a little kid, believed to be like a true free press, that you would have some individuals that were like that. Yeah, you're going to have people that take it and run with certain narratives, but like it seemed like logically you would also want to have people that are just, if you want to call it in the middle, or just, not taking a side, whatever you want to refer to it as, but just this independent of putting in a lot more of the opine, the hot takes on it, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like running a team too, you have to tell people to do that, because everybody, I think, who's a young person these days thinks, oh, well, everybody has a Twitter account, everybody wants to hear what my opinion is on this. And it's like, yo, you're here covering the event, stay in your lane. You're not Bill O'Reilly at 8:00 or Tucker Carlson, and I think everybody somehow has this idea in today's media landscape that everybody wants to hear what you have to say about every multitude of topics ever. Like, it's like, what is your area of expertise, and stay in that lane. And I think like all of us have gotten crap from both sides for saying the word protester when it's like, those are BLM rioting terrorists. And it's like, well, actually, it's not clear. They declared a riot, yes, but a lot of people were out there just protesting at the moment they declared that riot. Same vice versa in the Capitol. Those are domestic white supremacist terrorists. And it's like, well, okay, you weren't there. So it's, we'll leave that. I agree that the people who are showing the world what's going on in these situations should stay in their lane. And I think that you guys have done like a really good job of that. And, that's why we're all here right now. So
I would add that I think that there's a relationship from the content that we make to the type of content that can be analytical, right? So I tend to describe my work as actually the building blocks of documentary. Like I actually studied film and media arts. I did not study journalism as a profession, right? My, kind of aspiration, the thing that I actually like doing as an end goal of my work, other than simply informing the public, is providing the type of raw content that can then be used in documentaries to analyze the things that I was at. So it actually does enable the sorts of analytics, criticism, whatever, that can come later. But if you want people to have the informed positions, if you want people to be able to prove those hot takes and so forth, that people are begging me to like, oh, you have to take a position, you have to take a stand on this or that. Well, if you want the people who are actually taking a stand to do it in a way that's rooted in underlying truth, then you do have to have people who are, as BG puts it, independent, as I put it, objective, but we're talking about the same thing. You have to have that content to begin with in order to then analyze it from from truth comes reason, and then from reason can come, liberty or whatever other, thing you aspire to.
I'd put it as not a corporate stooge rather than independent, but.
Well, whatever we could do then to boost the collective analytical skills of the Twitterati or whoever's
Twitterati.
whoever's stirring everything up with their multitudes of followers and cherry picking every little bit to try to drill in this animus and propel people against each other. I think the outrage-based content, I'm hoping that we're seeing, as much as it may keep some of us out of, with less work, I think as a society we can hope for a moderation of that outrage-based culture, which gravitates so regularly in such a cliche manner towards labeling. I don't even know what these words mean anymore because they're thrown around so haphazardly. This person is this, and we're not discussing the content. We're not discussing the ideas. We're not discussing possible solutions. Instead, we're trying to just defame whoever said that and say, well, this person knows this person who was there at this event who did. It's this freewheeling sort of persecution by free association that we need to just get rid of, throw it out, because it doesn't. Defaming the person you're having a discussion with does not make you the winner of the argument. It may get you a couple of likes on social media, but ultimately it gives nothing to the conversation.
I would say on that, I feel there is hope with all of that to go forward. While things are really divided right now, and you do see these tensions really, flaring up everywhere, there also seems to be this increased yearning for the type of reporting that all of you have been doing. I mean, it's the tell it like it is reporting, the simply put it out there, and social media has been a huge catalyst for this. Before, when all you had were these handful of networks that funneled all information from all of their local affiliates, everything that was gathered across the country, and it just came out through these couple megaphones. Now you have, Richie McGinnis on Twitter that can just tweet out a video, and then and then it's right there. Ford Fischer, in the News 2 reports, and Jeremy Quinn with these in-depth analysis of what was the origin of this hashtag and how did this topic. I get excited talking about it just because I do see this growing attention being paid to these sort of voices and these sort of whether you want to call it analysts, documentarians, it all fits into the same thing of getting to the truth of it without getting too caught up in the opinions and getting too caught up in sort of this end narrative that people really love to jump on. And Richie said it best with talking about like the stay in your lane thing. Like, at what point did we all sign up to just like hear everybody's opinion on every topic?
Yes.
It's amazing. Like, it was so funny, and I have to call it out when everybody was talking about the GameStop stock and all that.
Yes.
And like all of a sudden, everybody is just suddenly an expert on trading and like it's time to sell, it's time to buy. And I'm just like, I'm sorry, like, actually, I do follow some like Bitcoin people. I actually do pay a lot of attention to that stuff kind of behind the scenes, but I don't tweet about it a lot because I, in no means, consider myself to be an expert or any kind of like substantial voice on that front. But it was so funny then, because I was already following those kind of accounts and those voices for years, that all of a sudden these mainstream people that mostly focused on like protest stuff or other news like that, all of a sudden all jumping in on this and like all of these, like, it's time to hold, we got to hold the line, all that. I'm just like, I mean, everybody's entitled to their opinion and statement, and like, I'm all for the free speech and whatnot, but at the same time, like, when your bios is reporter and the tweet says hold the line in all caps, like, what is this? What is this?
You're a reporter and you're tweeting hold the line on a stock that you hold shares of?
That you just bought probably in the last week, and like, I don't even know when was the last time you even checked your Robinhood account before this. Like, it's incredible. It's so, I do appreciate when I see people that are just calling it like it is, and of course people can always make their jokes about it and stuff like that. Every once in a while I'll even put out a meme, if it's something that I found really amusing. But generally speaking, it's about focusing on, what do you actually know? What can you talk about? And I think that for all of us, it's the things that we have witnessed while covering on the scene and being present for those things.
I would add that I think that in those situations, the bad thing is when people act the way you just described, but those sorts of interesting, new, sort of unprecedented moments are exactly when it's actually good to have independent press who does stay in their lane, as Richie said. So I do not pretend to be a market analyst, right? But my staying in my lane. The thing that I was actually able to cover when that happened was I was basically tracking on Reddit people talking about doing real world demonstrations as a result of it. And so I covered the 3 people who showed up at the SEC headquarters during the height of that situation, and I interviewed them, right? I did actually talk to the 3 people who in Washington, D.C. protested about this subject, and my story ended up being more about the SEC cop who claimed that it's illegal to film the building. And basically it turned into sort of a First Amendment audit where I was kind of debating with him, trying to see what I could get him to say as far as tell me about the law that says that, right? But anyway, I mean, I think that there are different skills, I guess, that all of us have. I know we're on here based on a joint kind of fascination with political activism, and so that's sort of the extent to which I was able to cover that. But I'm sure that there's other types of independent media who would have a role to step in there, saying something other than just hodl, like hodl GameStop,
Yeah, exactly.
hodl AMC or whatever, which is just sort of like, useless and not coming from a place of expertise.
Yeah, who are doing something other than just backing up, the hedge funds and the corporate special interests that obviously corporate media is more inclined to support than a bunch of guys in their basement. So.
Well, guys, thanks for being here. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but I appreciate you guys coming on for as long as you did, and we'll have to do this again because I think that there's a lot of stuff that I was picking up that I hadn't heard y'all talk about. So we'll have to compare more notes in the future. Now, where does this go from here? As I was saying, I don't know. May 1st is always a deal. Have you guys ever done May Day protests?
Yeah.
That's something that's been heavy on the left before this. One thing that people may not realize is that leading up to the George Floyd protests, May 1st came around, and because of COVID, among Twitter leftists, a kind of memo went out that said, we're not going to protest like we do every May 1st. Instead, think of other ways that you can do direct action or banner drops or whatever. And, I've been focused, I think, if I receive a lot of criticism, it is because I do focus on where I started, which was, I was covering tree sitters back in the late 2000s at UC Berkeley when I was an on-air reporter in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I'm very interested in culturally where this can go. And I do say the word anarchist more than I think other reporters do, because I think underlying everything is this sort of idealism of, and it's almost where the Boogaloo and the leftists line up, both declaring themselves in some cases as anarchists and being anti-government. I just hope that we could talk about these things and what's been going on in a practical enough manner that does not stoke the kind of endless struggle for some sort of, I don't know what it is that they're looking for, but certainly it's confused me this most of the last 9 or 10 months. And I hope that every single trial that's on the calendar, as much as it would put every one of us to work, doesn't escalate the way that we've seen it. So that's my hope.
I think the purpose should be basically, I mean, you were describing it as hoping not to sort of incite something. I think of my purpose as to inform people, and I hope that doing so in a reasonable, measured, and objective way is leaving them the most informed. I think that generally a byproduct of reasonable and objective reporting is probably that you would not breed radicalism in so doing. Mm-hmm. But if it did, right, if people saw video of something and then it causes them to do activism, I think it's something that we can be at least vaguely aware of, regardless of intentions, what kinds of effects can it have kind of ongoing. It's an issue to struggle with, and I don't know that there's a great answer to it, but it seems like an area that you just barely alluded to, and maybe it's something to talk about another time.
Otherwise, it just happens without anybody noticing. So, I mean, if Antifa throws a Molotov cocktail in Portland and there's no one there to report it, does it actually happen?
I would just say, I mean, a really strange anecdote once is I once saw someone had on a poster an image that I had taken. My watermark was on a protester's poster. This only happened once in 6 years.
When you know you made it.
But I pointed it out to them and they were like, "Oh, you took that," and I was like, "Yeah," and they were kind of apathetic about it. Like, it didn't actually matter to them. But to me, that was a really surreal experience about the cyclical nature of, as much as I have an intent of purely informing people and not inciting activism. I mean, that's a situation where arguably my work changed what ended up happening. Like, literally my image ended up on somebody's poster, therefore changing what someone would see if they went to the event. So it happens.
Very meta.
It is.
All right, guys.
Objective journalist or riot pornographer?
Why not both?
Well, that's where, and in conversations like this, you get to throw in a couple opinions here and there, and I think that's all for good measure in the mission of sort of trying to analyze this and see where we can improve as a society. If I am guilty of anything, it's hoping that we can achieve some sort of peace and understanding through our work and through what we report. So, thanks again, Richie McGinnis, Ford Fischer, BGontheScene, Brendan Gunsfager. Thank you so much for being here. Y'all, hit the like or the subscribe button. This is Unblocked Podcast, youtube.com/Unblocked Live. Next week, we actually have, I have a comedian, Matt Ruby, on Wednesday. Next week on Monday, I'm going to debate a little more with activist Kim Brown. And then I have Brett Weinstein a week from Wednesday. So come back. This is Unblocked Live. I hope I talk to all of you guys again very soon.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having us on.
Peace.
Care.
Thanks.